There are multiple questions that we need to consider as we begin our examination of the book of Job. There are the typical questions related to authorship. Who wrote the book of Job? When was the book of Job written? Where was the book of Job written? But there are also questions related to the story itself. Who was Job? Where did Job live? When did Job live? Did Job even live, or is this entire book simply a fictitious story, a mashal, the Hebrew term for a proverb? Given the way the epilogue of the book, chapter 42, is written, with Job living over a century after the events of the book, Job may not be the author. However, the epilogue of the book of Job is similar to the final chapter of Deuteronomy, where Moses is talked about in the third person, but still wrote the book. Job may then be the author of much of the book. Scholars who would deny the unity of the book of Job typically suggest that the first two chapters, the prologue, and the final chapter, the epilogue, came first, then the rest of the book, whereas in the case of Deuteronomy, Moses wrote the book and then the comments in the epilogue were written later, so a different timeline for writing than of Job. That, of course, is only if the timeline for the writing of the book, as suggested by many scholars, is correct, which may not be the case. Just because a group of scholars argue that a narrative framework existed before the rest of the book does not make it so, especially since the first two chapters and the final chapter make little sense without the middle chapters, and the middle chapters make little sense without the first two and final chapter. All of which means that the third-person description of Job in the final chapter does not definitively prove someone else wrote the book. But since the whole book is in the third person, there's also no proof within the book itself that Job did write the book, leaving the author completely anonymous. The question as to where the book is written is somewhat related to the identity of Job. Is Job an Israelite? The short answer is that the book doesn't say, at least not directly, but there does seem to be allusions to the fact that Job is not Jewish. For instance, Job is said to be from Uz, which is likely a town outside of Israel. There are multiple people or cities named Uz in the Bible, several connected with the ancient territory of Esau or Edom. The Greek version of Job, for instance, says in Job 42, verse 17, that this man is described in the Syriac book, living in the land of Ausis, A-U-S-I-S, or a version of Uz, on the borders of Idumea and Arabia. Others have tried to argue that Uz is found further south, in northwest Arabia, but still the general region is that border area in what used to be the land of Esau, the land of Edom. It's possible, in light of a man named Uz in Genesis chapter 22, verse 21, that Uz was an Aramean town, but since Arameans were all over the ancient Near East, that isn't very helpful. The greatest evidence seems to be towards Edom. Thus we read in Genesis 36 mentions of men named Teman and Eliphaz, both names that show up in Job with the friend Eliphaz the Temanite. The Greek translation, the Septuagint, wishes to argue that Job's name was really Jobab, J-O-B-A-B, who was a king of the Edomites. There are two Jobabs mentioned in Scripture, Genesis 10 and Genesis 36, each associated with an Uz, so Job could be either a descendant of Esau, using Genesis 36, or a close descendant of Shem from Genesis 10, but before the time of Abraham, before Israel even existed, although many scholars doubt the Septuagint's claim that Job and Jobab are the same person. At least by the time of Lamentations chapter 4 and Jeremiah chapter 25, Uz was linked with Edom. So the Uz here is probably, more than likely, although not definitively and not conclusively, in the land of Edom. And Edom, according to many scholars, was known for its wisdom. See Obadiah verses 8 and 9, for instance. There's also the fact that Job only once refers to God as Yahweh, in chapter 12, verse 9, and even that is a debated instance of the occurrence of the divine name. Typically, everyone uses older titles for God, like El or Eloach or Shaddai, which gives Job the foreign feel that much of the wisdom literature has. On the one hand, a connection with Edom is surprising. Why in the world would Israel include a story about an Edomite in their scriptures? Why would God call an Edomite of all things holy? But if God was trying to portray, as much as the wisdom literature does, a universal reality, one which is not simply found in God's covenant relationship with Israel, but a universal reality found everywhere on earth, that God is sovereign over all creation and all nations, that there are his people among all nations, and that all people suffer from time to time because of the sovereign will of God at work to accomplish his plans on earth, his will as it is in heaven, what better place to have the events take place than outside Israel? A setting outside of Israel also eliminates the possible confusion of retribution theology, the idea that good people prosper and evil people suffer, confusion with the blessings and curses of the covenant given through Moses. And yet that still doesn't tell us about the author of this book. Perhaps an Edomite wrote the book, although God is called Yahweh frequently in the prologue and in the epilogue when the Lord God Almighty speaks. Why would an Edomite in pre-Israeli times use the name of the Lord, Yahweh, a name which was only revealed to Israel in Exodus 6 at the time of the Exodus? Unlikely. What seems to be more likely is that an Israelite wrote the book about events set in Edom, again that Edomite setting giving that universal feel to the book. The Babylonian Talmud actually claims that Moses wrote the book, although that can't be proven or disproven. What further complicates the question is the writing of the book itself. There are many Aramaisms, that is, forms of the words and phrases that come from Aramaic rather than Hebrew. This may be a deliberate attempt to set the book outside of Israel, or an attempt to make the book seem more ancient, or evidence of a regional Hebrew dialect of which we're yet unaware. We can conclude that the story is either very old, set outside of Israel, or it's portrayed as really old and set outside of Israel. Job's long life fits well with the age of the patriarchs, and Edom was not a major enemy of Israel until Israel tried to go through Edom on the way to the Promised Land, and at the time of the exile. Clearly, the author is either ancient or wants us to view the book as ancient, as Daniel Estes suggests that it took place, quote, a long time ago in a land far, far away. That brings us to the biggest question about Job. Is this a true story? Eusebius, the church historian, as well as the Jewish Talmud, claim that this is a recorded conversation, that an eyewitness wrote this all down. One scholar by the name of Dorme, D-H-O-R-M-E, says that Job has, quote, the tone of real conversation, although other scholars, like Daniel Estes, argue for conscious crafting rather than artful spontaneity. Estes calls this a divinely inspired piece of imaginative literature. And the Babylonian Talmud, the same Talmud that says Moses wrote Job, also claims that the book is fiction, a conclusion that's agreed to by the Jewish scholar Maimonides. But to complicate matters, Job is mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 14 and 20, as an example of a righteous person. And James, in James chapter 5, verse 11 in the New Testament, also gives Job as a real example. So is Job a real person? The one question as to whether or not this is a historical book is closely followed up by the question, does it change its meaning if it's not? It would admittedly take away some of the force of the story, not to mention that readers must assume that the prologue and epilogue are still 100% factual, without doubting their veracity if they were fictional. How could theology or a conclusion related to wisdom be drawn from the story if the facts as presented are not theological true, but, quote, made up? Additionally, I can't see a poet, especially a Hebrew poet, trying to put words in the mouth of God that God did not actually speak, or trying to describe a heavenly scene in the prologue based purely on imagination. Perhaps those who claim it as fiction would see it as inspired fiction, the way that Estes does, as a way to get around these questions. Although if it's not fiction, but historical fact, one has to wrestle with how the author obtained his knowledge of the heavenly scene in the prologue, information which Job apparently never receives. It would appear that we're meant to conclude that Job lived outside Israel, at least on the surface, that he actually lived, probably in the region of Edom, with the book set in the time of the patriarchs, perhaps when Israel does not yet exist or is in Egypt, with the story being written down later by an unknown author, likely an Israelite, who set the story down in writing for his own purposes. The big question, though, is what is the purpose for which the writer is writing? This question is closely connected with another question. What type of literature is Job? Wisdom literature, as we have already stated, has more to do with content than form, but even then, did the author of Job write down the book with the intent to make it wisdom literature? There are countless foreign examples of similar types of books and stories written as wisdom literature, many of which deal with the similar circumstances of suffering, trying to explain the question of why people suffer. But is that why Job was written? On the one hand, it is very possible that the writer of Job indeed recorded the story to communicate an answer to one of life's questions, although we'll get to whether or not why suffering happens is the question being asked in just a moment. If, however, we accept the historical reality of what takes place in Job's life, then the book is not simply wisdom literature, but a record of a historical event, and a very personal lament, followed by a debate and a concluding theophany that together create a composition of incredible value in its instruction. But what is it that the author wishes to instruct? If the goal is to explain why bad things happen to good people, if that is the question, what is officially called a theodicy being a text that deals with problems of evil, a term coined all the way back in 1710, God does not actually answer that question. God's response in the final chapters is a defense of his actions, not an explanation of his actions. The question of why is not addressed. Additionally, if the answer is simply to say why bad things happen, the answer to that question is found in the first two chapters of the prologue, Satan and God have a wager, which raises the question as to whether or not that is indeed the question of why. The question that Satan presents to God is not why do bad things happen, but will a person still serve God if bad things happen? That question, at least according to Satan, is a question of faith. Will a person still have faith even in the midst of suffering? That is the, quote, problem that is presented at the outset of Job rather than why suffering happens, unless readers are to assume that suffering always happens because God and Satan always have a wager going. Job does indeed remain faithful despite suffering, which answers Satan's question, but the resulting information does seem to answer a deeper question concerning why, keeping in mind, as Westerman has pointed out, that Job is lamenting, the friends are debating, but this is not simply a philosophical exercise, but a personal experience that seems to have application to other sufferings. So with that, let me give a quick overview of the outline of Job. Chapters 1 and 2 are prologue, setting the background. Chapters 3 through 27 are a discussion between Job and his friends, although really chapter 3 starts the process with Job's first lament. Job begins to complain. His friends in 3 rounds try to correct him. Job defends himself each time. The last round of the 3, one of the friends, Zophar, is out of words and doesn't talk, although some have tried to find Zophar's last speech somewhere in chapters 26 or 27 or elsewhere. Chapter 28 is an excursus on wisdom, hotly debated concerning whose words are actually found in chapter 28, Job or the author's. In chapters 29 through 31, Job summarizes his complaint. In 32 through 37, an unknown friend, Elihu, speaks. In chapters 38 to 42, God speaks, and the end of 42 is the epilogue. Let's jump into the prologue. As I said earlier, if we didn't have the prologue, we'd be missing key information. For one thing, we wouldn't know what Job is suffering. The prologue is very specific as to what befalls Job, with the death of his children, loss of wealth, loss of health, his wife turning against him. If we didn't have this, we'd assume that he was suffering something bad. We just wouldn't have details. That actually wouldn't be that big of a deal, but the prologue certainly helps. But really, what is most helpful about the prologue is that it tells us the reason for which Job is not suffering. Specifically, Job is not suffering because of sin. Verse 1 of chapter 1 cuts right to the chase and tells us that Job is righteous, upright, fears God, and turns aside from evil. Job is not suffering punishment for sin. This automatically sets Job apart from the philosophy of the day. It was thought by most cultures that if you lived well, if you were wise, if you understood the pattern of creation, the pattern of the gods, the order of things, then you would have success and be prosperous. And to some degree, Israel had this idea reinforced into the covenant system. If Israel obeyed and followed God and did his law, they would be blessed. Life would be good health, good crops. On the flip side, if they disobeyed and broke the covenant, that God would bring all the curses upon them for the evil that they did. And so the assumption was that if someone was living poorly, life was falling apart, that they were suffering, had sickness, calamity, and so on, it must be because they were not living in line with the order of creation, not living according to what God wanted, not living according to wisdom, or in Israel's case, according to the covenant. So by the time of Christ, Jesus' disciples asked about blind Bartimaeus, who sinned, him or his parents. Israel and the other nations had a theology of retribution. A person who did well was given success. A person who did evil suffered. That was clearly what Job's friends thought, and even Job thought. However, what Israel and Job thought was not simple retribution theology, but double retribution theology. The theology worked backwards. Not only did those who did evil suffer, but those who suffered must be doing evil. Except that we're told from the very beginning that this is exactly not the case for Job. Job is not a sinner. He is not living poorly. He is not living against the created order. He is righteous, upright, even in verse 5, offering sacrifices for his children in case they had sinned at some point. So we have an immediate clue and indication that what Job is about to suffer is not retribution. Job knows that, but he struggles to understand then how this works. Not to mention that in verse 6 and following, we are told exactly why Job is suffering. There's no secret as to why this is happening, although it is secret from Job. This is completely different from any other book on suffering written in the ancient Near East. There are many different books on the topic of suffering. There's the Babylonian Theodicy, for instance, where the righteous sufferer is suffering, but he doesn't know why. In fact, he never learns why, if he has sinned or if he is innocent, because he actually concludes that the gods created man prone to deception, so he begins to question by the end of the story if his assessment of his own righteousness is even correct, especially when there are others telling him how much he has sinned, much like in the book of Job. But in Job, we begin with confirmation that Job is correct. He is, in fact, sinless. And our being told by the narrator why Job is suffering is unique among other writings. Ancient stories like, I will bless the God of wisdom, or the righteous sufferer, or the man and his God, all three of those stories being found in other cultures. In each of these stories, the person is suffering, claims to be righteous, but there is never an indication of whether or not they are actually righteous. In many of the stories, the sufferer actually confesses sin by the end of the story, not even knowing what the sin is. In some instances, the God who is causing them to suffer eventually relents. In others, he does not. Sometimes the help of an exorcist is key. In other instances, the exorcist does nothing. We never know in any of these writings why the person is suffering, nor is there ever a conversation with the God to give any sort of answer. The closest we ever get is in the story, I will bless the God of wisdom, where an exorcist or priest comes as the spokesperson of the god and says certain ceremonies have to be followed for the suffering to be relieved. That's the closest we ever get to an answer. All of the sufferers are left in the dark, and honestly, the gods are left looking pretty random and capricious. But here we have a clear explanation. Even though Job is not given the explanation, we as the readers are given an explanation for why Job is suffering. We are told that God and Satan are having a wager over Job. You'll notice that God, in verse 8 of chapter 1, in essence quotes verse 1 to Satan, telling Satan that Job is a righteous man. God's confidence in Job here is pretty remarkable. Not only is Job a righteous man, God believes that Job will remain faithful, even if Satan begins to afflict Job. We typically have a pessimistic view of man and his fickle nature, quickly falling away from God and his ways. But God here believes, and by the end of the book we see correctly believes, that Job will not curse God and will not fall away. Part of this we know from the New Testament is due to the work of God's grace, binding Job to himself. In the Old Testament, that type of theology has not been fully worked out and revealed yet, so we see no mention of why God is confident. We only know that he is fully confident that Job will maintain his righteousness. But who exactly is Satan? Our minds quickly jump to Satan, the tempter who shows up in Genesis chapter 3. What's curious is that Satan is not mentioned by name in Genesis chapter 3, and Satan doesn't really show up all that often in the Old Testament. He tempts David to take a census of the people in 1 Chronicles, although 1 Chronicles is written after the exile, much later than the apparent setting of Job. 1 Chronicles also changes the same story from the book of 2 Samuel, where in 2 Samuel it says that the Lord tempted David, and yet in 1 Chronicles it says Satan tempted David. Other than that, Satan only appears in Zechariah, another post-exilic book. Really, the concept of Satan as the devil, as a personified evil fallen angel named Lucifer, isn't found until the intertestamental period, and then in the New Testament. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is not Satan as we know him. What I'm saying is that we know that this is Satan, or Lucifer, or the devil, but Israel probably did not, and they did not have that theological category yet, even though Satan is occasionally hinted at in the Old Testament. And since the Israelites did not have that category, some scholars have said simply that we should leave this as the adversary, which is the English translation of the Hebrew Satan, Satan, adversary. Actually, here in Job 1 and 2, it is always with the definite article, the Satan, thus the adversary. This hasn't stopped other scholars, though, from trying to come up with theories about how Israel would have perceived the Satan. Tremper Longman believes that this Satan is an angel who works as God's spy service, as his eyes and ears on earth. That fits verse 7 of going around the earth, but not so much the accusations against Job, the cynical nature of verse 9. Note also that God, in verse 8, is the one who brings Job to Satan's attention. So it isn't necessarily Satan accusing of his own initiative as much as God showing off and using Job as a trophy piece. So that doesn't really fit the spy service angle. Crenshaw, one of the classic texts on the Poetic books, argues that Satan is an office, perhaps held by an angel. I had a prof in seminary, William Van Gemeren, who held this view, that this was really a wager between friends, which might be why Satan is never mentioned after chapter 2. Satan as an office may also fit the language of verse 6 about the sons of God. That might sound familiar from Genesis chapter 6. The sons of God, the spiritual leaders and powers coming together, and the Satan is there as well, or angels and the Satan is there as well. Others simply take the safe road and say Satan is an ambiguous character, although many of those scholars still think that Satan is not a member of the court. He just happens to come with the sons of God and be there. In the end, though, the story isn't really about Satan. Satan is really just a foil, a prop piece in this story, serving as a backdrop to why God began the wager in the first place. A wager that, again, we know about as readers, but Job never does. God never tells Job why this was all a test and that Job passed. We need to realize also, though, as Derek Kidner in his little commentary on these books points out, that even if the Satan is Satan, as we know him, Satan still needs God's permission to do anything to Job. There are boundaries that cannot be crossed of his own initiative. Keep that in mind because that will be important later when we talk about God's response in chapters 38 through 42. So the story as we have it begins with a righteous man and a wager between God and Satan. And we know that Job is about to suffer greatly. Sabaeans come in verse 15, which can be a little tricky for dating. Kenneth Kitchen says that the Sabaeans ruled from about 1200 on. Israel Finkelstein says more recent, starting at about 700 BC on. Of course, that's all based off of archaeology, which is difficult to date at times. Sabaeans could likely be the same as Sheba, as in the Queen of Sheba, but it's difficult to know if Sabaeans existed earlier than Solomon, can show up here in Job, or if this means that Job was written around the time of Solomon. Either way, Sabaeans are going to come and take the oxen, the donkeys. The Chaldeans, predecessors to the Babylonians, are going to take the camels. Job's kids are going to die. Job's going to be afflicted with sores, the same phrase from Leviticus chapter 13, boils, loathsome sores, evil boils, evil sores on his body, and Job's wife is going to turn against him. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, written in Egypt and surrounding area during the intertestamental period, actually has a longer speech by the wife. How long wilt thou hold out, saying, Behold, I wait yet a little while, expecting the hope of my deliverance. For behold, thy memorial is abolished from the earth, your sons and your daughters. The pangs and pains of my womb, which I bore in vain with sorrows. And you sittest down to spend nights in the open air among the corruption of worms. And I am a wanderer and a servant from place to place, house to house, waiting for the setting of the sun, that I may rest from my labors and my pangs which now beset me. But say some word against the Lord, and die. The Hebrew version, which is found in our Bibles, is obviously much shorter. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. It's worth noting that Job's wife has lost children in this calamity as well, children she gave birth to, which is a theme that's picked up on in the Septuagint. The Hebrew version makes very little mention of the suffering she is going through. We could, in a sense, end after chapter 2 of the book of Job. There is an answer given by Job to how we should respond to not knowing. He says it again and again. Should we accept the good from God and not the bad? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away, the name of the Lord is to be praised. This is the right answer. Job doesn't understand what's going on, but God obviously does. The Lord, Yahweh, obviously does, so he should be trusted. Boom, done, end of book. You don't understand, you won't understand, so trust that God does understand. He knows what he's doing. Case closed, discussion over. But that's not real life. Life is not full of easy answers, even when you know it's the right answer. Does it help if we are told that we need to suck it up and deal with it because it's obviously part of God's plan for our life? Does that really make us feel better, even if you knew it to be true? Job knows the right answer, in a sense. but now he just has to believe the right answer, and that's where it gets difficult. That's where it gets real. Job is wrestling with how to put this all together in his mind. He knows God did it. He knows he should just fear God. But what do you do when life doesn't play by the rules? Why is God treating him this way? O. Palmer Robertson says that this book teaches us how to puzzle. I would add that it teaches us how to accept life's puzzles and God's answers, even when we don't like the answers, and even when the answers don't make sense. Job knows, in part, the answer. He just doesn't think the answer is fair or just or wise. He seems to know the answer to why. He just doesn't like it. And that's what he will wrestle with for the next 30 or so chapters. Job's ridiculous friends appear in chapter 3 and are also wrestling with this set of circumstances, except that they aren't willing to accept that Job has done nothing wrong. They believe there is a pattern, a created order, and God will always follow it. Job must have therefore upset the order and sinned. They simply cannot wrap their minds around the notion that Job is innocent. Job begins in chapter 3 with a lament to God, not cursing God, but cursing the day of his birth. As the book progresses, each friend will respond to Job, and Job will then defend himself. But initially, and more so as the book continues, Job's lament is not really to the friends, but to God. The friends simply feel the need to step in and speak for God, to defend God. Eventually, God will defend himself and say that the friends did not defend his character truthfully. As the debate continues, the friends grow more and more frustrated with Job's lack of repentance, since in their minds repentance would bring an end to suffering. And since Job will not admit some secret evil, by the last cycle of speeches, the friends begin to invent offenses. Job, though, will not let go of his innocence. He wishes then to have God come and explain to him why he's suffering. Initially, Job doesn't think that will work because he doesn't think God will give him a straight answer, but will overwhelm him, which happens to some degree. Job will be overwhelmed, but overwhelmed not to be destroyed, but to see the truth of God's character. Job is concerned that God is, on the one hand, not wise in his dealings with humans, but capricious and apparently a little cruel. That leads Job also to think that God must not be just. The problem for Job is that his theology is just like that of his friends. The system of retribution says that if you sin, you suffer. If you suffer, it's because you sinned. But Job has not sinned, and yet is suffering. Thus, something is wrong with the system. And since Job will not give up his claim to integrity, it must be God who is in the wrong. Job uses legal language then to cry out to God for a face-to-face encounter. Job also cries out for a mediator in chapter 6 and a redeemer in chapter 19 who will defend him against God. Who is this mediator, this redeemer that lives? Well, before we jump to Christ, consider if Job would have thought of Christ. Some scholars have argued that Job is thinking of a later human being who will defend him, which is certainly possible, but that fails to answer all the objections for why Job believes that as a human he can't defend himself, let alone someone else. Others think that Job's legal case itself is the witness, the mediator, the redeemer. And while that's a novel idea, even as Job inscribes his case in the rock in chapter 19, most scholars reject it. Others believe that the mediator or redeemer is a spiritual figure, perhaps an angel, although Elihu will later say that even if such an angel should appear, he would side with God, not Job. The most common conclusion by scholars is that God is the one that Job trusts in as his mediator and redeemer, that Job believes the only one who can defend Job against God is God. That has perhaps given rise to the interpretation of Job 13, verse 15. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Although the Hebrew seems to point more towards, he will slay me, I have no hope. Job certainly has hope in God, that's clear, even if Job 13:15 does not say that explicitly. Job does believe that he will stand before God and that eventually he will be vindicated, possibly, depending on how we understand mediator and redeemer, by God himself. Which does raise the question as to whether or not Job believes in an afterlife. Many scholars question if a belief in the afterlife existed at this point in history. In some instances, Job seems to consider an afterlife but dismiss it, as he talks about going down to the grave. Chapter 14, verse 14, he says, if a man dies, should he live again? Or even chapter 19, verse 21, I will lie in the earth and you will seek me, but I shall not be. Yet even then, at times there is a hint of an afterlife, again in Job 19, where Job believes he will see God. There appears to be hints of an afterlife, maybe not a full-blown bodily resurrection, but, as some scholars say, a spiritual existence. But at the very least, intentionally or otherwise, there are hints that Job at least hints at times, and hopes at times, that there is something after death. Sadly, he has that hope because he really believes God is about to kill him. The debate between Job and his friends culminates in chapters 27 through 31, where Job summarizes his case, lays a series of oaths upon himself and God, and demands that God respond. Prior to that final demand, there is Job 28 and a consideration of wisdom. Man cannot find wisdom. Man can find a lot, but not wisdom. Only God knows where it is. The response then of man should be fear of God and keeping his commandments. In other words, relying on the revelation of God, of what he is told and required of man. You see this as well in verse 27. God saw wisdom and declared it. God has wisdom, established it, created it, possessed it, but also has revealed it. So if one wants wisdom, they need to seek it from God, fearing him and following what he has revealed. Life is chaotic, and the pat answers of worldly philosophy simply do not work. So what do? Go to the one who has the wisdom. Go to God and hope and pray that he reveals, declares to you wisdom to understand. And if he chooses not to, you simply have to trust him, maintaining obedience and faith in him. Estes sums this up by saying, quote, humans cannot discover God's wisdom by their own reasoning, so he must speak if wisdom is to be achieved. End quote. All of this assumes the necessity of chapters 38 through 42, and what we have said in comparison with the wisdom of the ancient Near East where the God never speaks. In other words, rather than demanding an explanation, Job should trust God's sovereignty and wisdom and ask God to speak. Of course, all of this raises an interesting question. Who is speaking in chapter 28 of Job? Some believe it is Job. Longman says that Job is having a, quote, moment of clarity and calm, as we often do, but then find ourselves soon plunged into darkness once again, end quote, as Job does in the next few chapters. One scholar says that it's a redactor who, quote, rejects the possibility of human discovery of wisdom, end quote, which sets up God's speech, and as we'll see soon, also makes Elihu look pretty foolish, since he attempts to answer for God. All scholars, those who think it's Job writing or otherwise, suggest the chapter is intended to be a bit of a reprieve, an intermission as it were, preparing us as readers for the rest of the book, specifically for God to speak. After Job's summary in chapters 27 through 31, ending with the oaths laid upon himself that will force God to address Job's questions, Elihu appears on the scene in chapter 32, claiming to have been there the whole time. And we assume he's telling the truth, that he has been there listening to all that has been said before. Chapter 32 explains in part that Elihu was waiting until the older three men and Job had spoken before giving his own answer. And yet we wonder why Elihu wasn't mentioned before, and to make him even more mysterious, God answers the three friends in chapter 42, but ignores Elihu, as though Elihu never spoke, or as if God never heard anything Elihu said. The speeches of Elihu are actually comprised of 4 speeches, each quoting something Job has said and then trying to correct his words. We're left wondering then what to do with the speeches of Elihu. The first option is that some have suggested the speech is inserted here by some other author well after the rest of Job is written. For instance, we notice that there are more Hebrew words in the book of Job that are only used by Elihu. There are more Aramaic vocabulary used by Elihu than in the other sections, and there's a different style. Thus, the theory is that this section was authored by an author who is not as good of a poet as the original author, since Elihu's speech is not as elevated or as well written. Even Robert Alter seems to think that that might be the case. Although we've been told that Elihu is younger, and as Robert Alter says, he is a bombastic, presumptuous, irascible blowhard, so as we understand that Elihu is brash and immature, it would explain why his speech is less than polished. Other scholars suggest that this is the same author as the rest of the book, just that he wrote the section of Elihu much later than the rest of the book, perhaps at the end of his life. Although you would expect, and this is my opinion, that if the author of Job wrote this part of the book later, that he would be wiser, less bombastic and youthful, and even more insightful. You would expect an older wise person to put the dumb theories in the mouths of the young and the correct theory in an older, wiser person, or at the very least make the young person seem precocious rather than a brash windbag. There are, however, those scholars who think that Elihu is placed here because of a second reason, a second option, and that is that he has a correct perspective. Some scholars believe that Elihu is correct in the sense that his role is to sum up all the arguments that have been made by Job and his friends from chapters 3 through 31. God doesn't rebuke Elihu, according to this theory, because Elihu's role is just to summarize and say what he thinks of the previous discussion. And so God, in that sense, basically agrees with the summary and assessment. The previous theories, including Job's, have been wrong. And so Elihu is just a bridge between the others and God, a summary and a condemnation before God gives his own thoughts on the matter. Others think that Elihu is correct in actually adding something that is not yet presented in this book, as a suggestion for understanding why Job is suffering. This something is that suffering prevents further evil. Suffering is not punishment, it's not retribution, but it is discipline that is calling men to repentance. That's not exactly a new idea, though, because Eliphaz in chapter 5, verse 17 said the same thing. Behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves, therefore despise not the discipline of the Almighty. Not to mention what is even more obvious, and that is that Elihu is incorrect in his assessment of God's actions. Because even if Elihu is correct, that suffering is more likely to be discipline than straight retribution, we know that God is actually not disciplining Job for sin, or, quote, bringing back Job's soul from the pit. Robertson says, quote, all this time, through all these trials, God has been speaking to Job not in judgment but in grace. And by this speaking, God has been humbling him, keeping him from wrongdoing, preserving his soul, end quote. But is this correct by Robertson? No, because Job has not done any of this. We know that it was not God, but the Satan figure who afflicted Job. Yes, God allowed it, but not to teach Job or to instruct him, but to win a bet with the Satan figure. Elihu's perspective may, as some scholars have pointed out, have some correct elements in it, and at times Robertson would be correct. But even then, as much as we're giving some tweaking to the retribution perspective by unpacking the elements of discipline, we know from the prologue, from chapters 1 and 2, that that is not the case here. How can we say that this is discipline for sin, or that God is graciously trying to warn Job, when God has already declared that Job is righteous? In fact, he was chosen because he was righteous. Elihu is not correct about the most important question Job is asking. Why is this happening? Which leaves then option 3. Elihu isn't correct. But then we're left wondering, why isn't Elihu condemned by God like the other friends? I'd say the easiest response is that, well, he isn't worth responding to. Remember what we heard in chapter 28? Remember the point there? Wisdom is only found in God. And then almost as an outcry that Job is at wit's end, that he has hit rock bottom, and after 28 realizes that his only hope is an explanation from God, the words of Job end at the end of chapter 31, with Job crying out to God and laying an oath, almost a curse upon himself, trying to force God to act, for God to speak. So then who do we expect to hear from next, seeing as wisdom only comes from God, seeing as only God can explain all that's going on in Job's life? Only God has the answer, so who will speak next? Well, not God. It's the young upstart Elihu. The author of Job portrays Elihu as a young whippersnapper who dares speak when we're all expectantly waiting for God to speak. In fact, Elihu doesn't think God will speak because Elihu thinks God has already spoken through the suffering. And, not to mention, in chapter 35, verses 12 through 15, Elihu doesn't think that God listens to the guilty anyway, which is what he thinks Job is. Elihu illustrates that both old wisdom and young wisdom, all human wisdom, will not be sufficient. Elihu just looks silly, so silly that God doesn't even respond to him. Elihu is too immature and too full of himself to even deserve an answer. So, mistakenly having believed himself to be the mouthpiece of God, God has nothing to say. Ironic. There are those, of course, who suggest that Elihu's speeches do not belong here in the book of Job, but consider this argument from Michael Fishbane. We have 2 rounds of dialogue between God and Satan to open the book. We have 2 rounds of dialogue between God and Job to close the book. We have 4 rounds of debate from Job, 3 of those with his friends, and then again 4 rounds of speeches of Elihu. Does this put the debate to rest completely? No, but it shows that Elihu's speeches do fit in the structure of the book. End quote. And I've already explained why I think Elihu's speeches are different structurally, him being young and pompous. But as Estes points out, Elihu, while looking like a fool for speaking when wisdom can only be found from God, does make us more eager for God to speak. Elihu also does do a good job of rehashing and summarizing everything that is said before. So Elihu's function really does seem to be setting the stage for God and making it more obvious that God needs to speak. He's the last to speak before God, but his youthful arrogance serves as the perfect climax of the failed perspective of human wisdom. We are now ready to discuss God's response in chapters 38 through 42, which is appropriate because we've been building up to this point all along. We have argued that wisdom is ultimately a gift of God and ultimately revealed by God. And that's just what God's about to do. He's about to reveal himself. Although it's important to realize that while this is a revelation of God, God is offering Job wisdom, not necessarily answers. O. Palmer Robertson wisely states that, quote, "The Redeemer does not whisper in the ear of every struggling saint the cosmic circumstance behind his suffering." End quote. God is going to give Job wisdom, not answers. Instead, Job's going to be left with a sense of awe and wonder that God knows all and is in control of all. Wisdom and wonder really go hand in hand. Job is going to realize that he does not know everything and he does not need to know everything. Instead, he just simply needs to trust God. What's interesting, though, among scholars of the book of Job is the multitude of different perspectives about how God teaches in his speeches in chapters 38 through 42 these points to Job. For instance, Leo Perdue in his book suggests that Job has argued that God is a divine tyrant who is, quote, "corrupt and brings destruction to his own creation," end quote. We've seen Job question God, but this is probably a little too extreme of an interpretation. Job's friends have suggested that Job is trying to be God, and so Perdue argues that God is putting a challenger in his place, quote, "humbling Job into uttering words of contrite doxology," end quote. Thus, God mocks Job, pointing out that only God can providentially care for creation. Perdue's conclusion is that Job comes to realize that retribution theology doesn't work because God doesn't care enough about human beings to make it work. Quote, "In the world Yahweh has fashioned, humans are not important or cherished," end quote. Perdue believes that this is God's point, since God says that he cares for the parts of the world that hurt humans. In fact, Perdue goes so far to say that God can limit chaos, restrain it, but not even God can eliminate it. But, and I'm putting words in Perdue's mouth here, since containment is better than nothing, we should just trust God. And so in the end, Perdue believes that Job's statement in verse 6 of chapter 42, "I repent in dust and ashes," actually means I protest and feel sorry for dust and ashes. That is, for humans. Why? Because God is a tyrant. Says Perdue, quote, "It is Yahweh who has been judged guilty, not Job, for the voice from the whirlwind has been condemned by his own words," end quote. For Perdue, only the epilogue, the restoration of Job, shows that God is just and will set things right. Perdue believes that were we left without the epilogue, God would not be confessed as judge. Admittedly, though, Perdue is extreme, very extreme, and I mention it only because it illustrates the fact that a scholar can agree with everything we've said about wisdom only being found from God, revealed by God, that the wisdom of the culture, the wisdom of the day, in this case retribution theology, is flawed. Man cannot know exactly why things happen, that there is chaos, there is disorder, and ultimately that God is the only one who can rule it all, and yet still have used such bizarre theories and interpretations to arrive at these conclusions. That's why I say that scholars are fairly agreed on the conclusion of the book of Job, the point that the book is making. They vary in how they get there. And I think that Perdue shows the danger of only looking at the conclusion, because a lot of what he says is incorrect and unbiblical and borderline blasphemous. So, if we know where we're going, what is it that ultimately God is going to teach Job in these speeches? The question we need to consider is how we arrived at this point. How does God teach this to Job? Other scholars suggest that God simply overwhelms Job. One scholar, Stuart Reek, says that, quote, "God only has one point. Nobody has the power to argue with him, and certainly not Job," end quote. Weeks is suggesting that God teaches Job that wisdom is keeping your mouth shut, and he does this by overwhelming Job with incredible power. Basically telling Job, "I'm in charge here, and when I want your opinion, I'll ask for it. Until then, trust I know what I'm doing because I'm more powerful than you." Robert Alter also cites this as an option.
quote, there could be no real answer, and that the sufferer would have to be content with God's sheer willingness to express his concern for his creatures. And, if you can't begin to play in my league, you should not have the nerve to ask questions about the rules of the game, end quote. Derek Kidner seems to hold a similar theory when he says that the point of God's speeches is that Job and his friends are victims of inevitable ignorance, appointed littleness, Kidner calls it. Thus, says Kidner, God cuts Job, quote, down to size, treating us and Job not as philosophers but as children, end quote. Again, the theme is that Job is humbled. Mark Sneed says that, quote, God harangued Job, end quote, bullying him into submission. Sneed says God, quote, dresses Job down and puts him in his place because God's honor is at stake in the contest between Satan and himself, and so God must save face, end quote. Sneed also takes the conclusion is a slightly different direction following Michael Fox. Quote, inexplicable suffering has a role in the divine moral economy, for it makes true piety possible, end quote. Thus, Sneed concludes from Fox, in Sneed's words, quote, just as a patron needs clients to accrue more honor and privilege, God needs loyal adherents who bring him more honor, end quote. God then, according to Sneed, has bullied Job, shamed him into honoring God because God needs Job's honor. Although we have to wonder, if God is simply putting Job in his place, why does God restore Job? If there's no reason, then maybe God is just as randomly good as he is randomly destructive, and Job shouldn't read any affirmation or vindication into the later blessing. Thus, Bartholomew and O'Dowd are on a better track when they say, quote, God's power is overwhelming, but so too are his presence and his willingness to invite Job into dialogue, end quote. Bullying, shaming, simply overwhelming, all of those make the speeches of God negative, which, as we'll see in just a moment, the speeches are not, at least not completely. While there is overwhelming, who is it that darkens my counsel, surely you know, this is not bullying. As Bartholomew and O'Dowd say, quote, Job does not need to know more, rather he needs to learn a humble and yet intimate relationship with God that enables him to embrace his creatureliness, end quote. Bullock says the same, quote, Job receives the answer to his question partly from the fact of the Lord's appearances, end quote. Therefore we understand, as Alter himself says, quote, God cares enough about man to reveal himself to mankind, end quote. Which is great. That says that the speeches themselves are the speeches that encourage us and let us know that God is watching. And yet, what about the content? Thus, Alter states, quote, God's speeches at the end have, after all, a specific content, end quote. God is not trying to bully Job, but teach Job, instruct Job, transform Job. Otherwise, why would we even bother to look at the words of Job here in this book and the words of God to Job in chapters 38 to 42? If the point is just to overwhelm him and overwhelm us, all we need to do is read the first line. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. And we'd say, okay, I'm overwhelmed. We'd be left then with just the fact that God is still there, and then we'd have to say with Crenshaw that these speeches are irrelevant. But this is where I think that the theory of overwhelming, as some scholars prevent it, or of bullying Job, and by extension us into submission, or even the fact of revelation as the solution, doesn't sufficiently explain the speeches of God. God is trying to teach and transform, which means that the content of these chapters is important. Trevor Longman has suggested that God does not really care about Job's challenge. However, the content demonstrates that that's not true, that God actually cares very much about what Job has said. In fact, God uses Job's words against him. Job makes a complaint in chapter 9 and in chapter 12 talking about nature and how that proves that God is unapproachable. And yet, as God begins his speech in chapter 38, he uses the same demonstrations of power, but for a completely different purpose. God uses Job's language from chapter 9, but he twists it to give the same words a different perspective, the correct perspective. Again, if we went with the theory that God was simply overwhelming Job, we'd be a little confused because Job in chapter 9 is already overwhelmed by the information. But God instead responds to Job, showing him that there's a different perspective. God even takes some of the words of the three friends and gives their word the correct perspective. Eliphaz in chapter 4, verses 9 through 11, talks about lions. God states the same fact in chapter 38, verses 39 through 41, talking about lions, although there it's providential. Eliphaz's point was that God can destroy even the mighty lion. God's point is that he takes care of the lion. Zohar as well pointed to nature in chapter 11, 7 through 9. This sounds like God's speech in chapter 38, verse 5. Who determined the measurements? Surely you know, or stretched out a line upon it. But Zohar's point was that Job can't argue with God because obviously Job is guilty. God, though, is trying to get Job to realize there's much that he does not understand. The same is true even of Elihu as he appeals to God's power and nature in chapter 37. God again balances this out in chapter 38, but he does it from the correct perspective, showing that wisdom realizes there's much that they don't understand. Even chapter 3, as Job talks about various aspects of his birth, God again uses those same exact words later in chapters 38 through 41. Even the comparison between Job cursing the shout of joy when he was conceived, God speaks not of the curse of him being conceived in chapter 3, verse 7, but in chapter 38, verse 7, speaking of the sons of God shouting for joy. Both days were light, but Job wanted darkness. Not to mention the reference to son, now the sons of God. Job spoke of the door of the womb, wishing they were shut to keep him from being born, chapter 3, verse 10. God speaks in chapter 38, verse 8, who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? Again, God is taking Job's words, and he's agreeing with Job said, but not with what Job meant. It's interesting that God is listening so well to what Job has said that he uses his very words against him. He uses the friends' speeches against them. Over and over and over again, God uses the words of Job and the words of the friends to twist and adapt their perspective to the correct perspective. It's how God teaches wisdom, letting God make the emphasis that he knows what's going on, even though Job does not. So as God corrects Job's perspective, what is it that God wants Job to see? Well, there are two main accusations that Job leveled against God, that God was unwise and that God was unjust. Throughout the rest of chapter 39, really as a continuation of chapter 38, it is not just God's sovereign care that is being focused upon, but God's wisdom. For instance, the ostrich is mentioned, which is quite stupid to say the least, and yet God says that there is a beauty even in the ostrich. Not to mention all the violence that takes place. The violent and evil animals, we might say, those that are destructive, are addressed in verses 19 through 30. The war horse, the eagle, all tearing the slain, and yet despite the violence, God is the one who wisely orchestrates all of it. We might think, seeing all this violence, that this passage is saying that this isn't right, and yet we realize that things must die for the eagle's young to eat. They must suffer in order for the eagles to eat. All of it, says God, is ordered by him, wisely, even if it looks bizarre, like the ostrich, even if it looks unfair, like the killing of prey for the sake of the eagles. God is asking Job, then, if Job can really accuse God of fault, but really what he's asking Job is, does Job have the wisdom necessary to control it all? And the answer is obviously no. Job is smart enough at this point to keep his mouth shut. Estes suggests that Job's statement of, quote, being of small account in chapter 40 is really just a start of Job's confession. He keeps his mouth shut, admits his smallness, but he doesn't fully confess his folly yet until chapter 42. Perdue believes that Job is being sarcastic and is basically saying, well, obviously I'm small and I'm of no account to you, God, which is why God is not done and moves on to a second speech. Not every scholar is convinced that the two speeches have different purposes. Many scholars believe that there is simply one speech, especially among those who believe that there was a necessity of the content and not just of the actual speaking, and yet still they view at times that it's just one speech continued in two parts. But God makes a second point in his second speech, and that is that not only is he wise enough to orchestrate the world, but he is also just, because this was Job's second accusation, that God is unjust. And yet the verses emphasize that God is just, even if Job is holy and still suffering. Job cannot assume that there is an either-or option. As God asks in chapter 40, verse 8, will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me so that you may be in the right? It's not Job's justification versus God's justice. God is just even though Job is innocent. In fact, Job is challenged, since he thinks he's the expert, if he can be as just as God.
Eventually, God will narrow his focus in the rest of chapter 40 through 42 down to Behemoth and Leviathan. Behemoth is in chapter 40, verses 15 through 24. Some have suggested that the hippo is the behemoth, but not all of the metaphors fit. Chapter 41 asks similar questions about Leviathan as about behemoth. Some scholars have suggested that they are both animals, that behemoth is a hippo and that Leviathan is a crocodile. Some have suggested that behemoth is a land animal, Leviathan is a sea animal. Others have suggested that behemoth is an actual animal, whereas Leviathan is figurative. Leviathan, though, showed up earlier in Job's speeches. Chapter 3, verse 8. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Alter says that this is in reference to mythological cursing. Curse and round up sound similar. Day may be sea, where Leviathan lives, Yam and Yom. Presumably, then, Leviathan is the curse that is roused up. But Job also asks in Job 7, verse 12, Am I the sea, or a sea monster, that you set a guard over me? The sea monster here, the word tannin in Hebrew, is not the word Leviathan in Hebrew, but more than likely it is still Leviathan that is in mind. So God is again using Job's words. God is asking if Job can restrain these two beasts. Beasts who mythologically often symbolize chaos. Again, Leviathan is probably not an actual creature. Perhaps the most fearful sea creature imaginable, says Longman. Purdue, though, says that God can only contain it, even though Isaiah 27:1 says God will slay it. But other scholars see these as actual references to the mythological, that God is basically saying to Job, yes, there is suffering in the world, there is chaos, but Job, can you control it? God never mentions Satan or the Satan, but we could include him here in the chaos because even he is under the control of God. And so God is asking if Job, quote, put God in a box. If Job cannot control Leviathan, who is nowhere near as powerful and mighty as God, then how can Job stand before God? Weeks says the same. If Job can't control Leviathan, then he can't control God by a system like retribution theology. It's wrong, suggests Weeks, to devise rules of any sort about God. But all of this, again, is supposed to point out God's justice, that God is controlling Leviathan and Behemoth. He is controlling the chaos. There is suffering in the world. He is aware of it, and he is addressing it. Maybe not the way Job wants, but he is addressing it. Which is something that Job in chapter 42 seems to finally get. The question of suffering is not about retribution, but actually about God's wise and sovereign and just control of the world. I know that you can do all things, that no purpose of yours can be thwarted, he says. Job finally realizes that while he doesn't know, there are forces at work that he cannot see. But Job also realizes the importance of questioning God and realizing that God alone has the answers. Job along the way thought he knew the answer, and he demanded an explanation, but now he realizes he doesn't know the answer, and while he can ask for an explanation, and God has indeed made an explanation known, not saying why per se, Job surely does not have the answer that he expected, but he does have an answer of another kind, emphasizing once again that wisdom is from the revelation of God. The world is permeated with it, says one scholar. It presents to the human eye a welter of contradictions that men cannot take in. And so Job has gained a new understanding, even as he claims in verse 3 that he lacked it. Job thought that he understood. Now he realizes that he doesn't understand. It's not just God's power that he's come to understand, because Job has mentioned God's power many times along the way. Now he realizes that God is wise in his orchestrations of the world and just, that God is fully aware of the problems of evil, and that God is addressing them. God is controlling them. When Job finally realizes this, he says, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. This is Job's confession for being, quote, presumptuous, says Robert Alter. It's Job's declaration that now, since he understands, and in part understands that he doesn't understand, he is, as Estes says, retracting his claim against God. Weeks points out that the Hebrew upon is better than repent of dust and ashes, and may be an indication that Job is repenting of his statement in chapter 30, verse 19, that God had cast him down to make him like dust and ashes. so that he's repenting about the dust and the ashes. Weeks thinks that Job is changing his mind here to say that he's not dust and ashes, but has a worth under the care of God, which really counters Abraham's statement in Genesis 18, where Abraham refers to himself as dust and ashes. Of course, Weeks has an odd view of God's address to the friends, saying that they weren't incorrect, but that they failed to settle the matter. Again, that fits, it's just odd. Crenshaw raises a good point. Why is Job repenting when all along he said he was righteous? The answer is that Job's suffering wasn't sinful, but he was asking a question whose answer he, as a human being, could not handle. So perhaps when Job says that he is repenting of dust and ashes, he's using it the way that Abraham uses it in Genesis 18. He is saying that he is but human, and he is recognizing a place of humility before God. Of course, it's also possible that he could just be meaning this literally, and that he's no longer going to sit on the dust and ash pile where he started the story. The concluding verses of the book tell us that Job was restored, and the friends are condemned. Estes suggests that the friends were condemned because even though they attempted to defend God, they really put him in a box, ignoring God's wisdom and sovereignty that was far beyond theirs. They spoke out of turn. Eliphaz is marked as the leader of the group because he spoke first. Job's restoration further proves that Job was righteous and that this turn of suffering had nothing to do with Job's behavior. Many scholars have suggested that the epilogue almost appears to undo everything else in the book by suggesting that retribution theology actually works, that good people always come out blessed. Well, that's reading too much into it. Here, God's blessing simply emphasizes for all those who saw the events that Job was righteous all along. It's actually confirmation of what Job had said, that Job was righteous and yet still suffered. Again, the whole point has been the freedom of God to bless or curse as he desires to accomplish his sovereign will by his perfect wisdom. So even though scholars, such as Stuart Weeks, claim that there is no clear message to the book and that the whole debate is inadequate, other than that there are no rules that constrain God, there is a message to the book, and that is that true wisdom lets God be God. Or as Longman puts it, quote, the proper human response to God's wisdom is submission, but also that wisdom is fundamentally the result of a relationship with God, end quote. So as we consider the book of Job, we see that Job has indeed had a restored relationship with God. He has found that wisdom's true source is in God, and that there are things that are simply beyond his concept of wisdom and justice, things that only God can grasp. Job understands that even though there are no answers, per se, to the question of why, while there's still no explanation, while there's still chaos, Job now realizes that it's supposed to be there, because God said it was supposed to be there. God is the one who is wisely and justly in control of it all.